Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this web event from the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Nat Malkus. I'm the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI and an affiliate of the James Q. Wilson Program in K-12 Education Studies. We're here today to talk about school choice and specifically how a federal school choice initiative might be done through budget reconciliation. For a little context, strange to know, after sweeping the House, the Senate, and the presidency in 2024, the Republican Party has a historic opportunity to pass a raft of policy priorities. But with tight margins in Congress, particularly in the Senate, some of the biggest policy changes may have to come through budget reconciliation. Why that process? We'll get to that in a moment with some experts better than I to answer that. But one of those Republican policy priorities is school choice. And although school choice has been gaining momentum largely in the states, primarily through education savings accounts in the past several years, it's long been a state policy initiative, one that's backed or not backed from Washington. But as Republicans look to bring on a federal school choice initiative, probably some version of the Educational Choice for Children Act. More on that in a moment too. It's looking like the Overton window for a federal school choice initiative is open wider, maybe than ever before. So both the ECCA and the budget reconciliation process are complicated. So fortunately, I've brought on 4 experts to help unpack this process and these possibilities. Joining me today is Lindsay Fryer, who's the president and founding principal of Lodestone DC, a DC-based government relations, lobbying, and consulting firm focused on education, workforce, research, and social services policy. Previously, Lindsay worked as a congressional staffer, and she was the principal negotiator for Lamar Alexander on the Every Student Succeeds Act. Also joining me is John Schilling, the founder and president of 2020 Strategies, a consulting firm. He was previously the president and COO of the American Federation for Children, an advocacy organization that promotes school choice. Mike McShane is an adjunct fellow here at AEI and the director of research at the director of national research at EdChoice, a school choice research and advocacy organization. And last but not least, Lindsay Burke, our second Lindsay, is the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. So we're going to have a discussion, and I'm going to ask a few questions. And in the last 10 minutes or so of today's web event, we'll be opening the floor up for questions from you, the audience. You can send those to us by email at greg.fournier@aei.org or on X or Twitter using the hashtag Federal School Choice. So, Lindsay Fryer, I'd like to start with you. The title for this webinar, A Time for Choice, Budget Reconciliation and Federal School Choice Legislation. A pairing of concepts that may not be that familiar to most folks. Can you help us with the first part there? Budget reconciliation. What is it, and why does it have a connection to school choice?
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me here. I always like these webinar series, so exciting to talk about this topic. So what is this wonky budget reconciliation process? In short, it's an expedited way to legislate on taxes, spending or savings, or the debt limit. The only spending that is eligible for consideration is something called mandatory spending. So things like social services, Medicare, and in the education space, that's usually dealing with student loans or a portion of the Pell Grants. And just as an example, reconciliation was used to pass the American Rescue Plan when the Democrats were in charge, and the Trump tax cuts when the Republicans were in charge several years ago. And the reason why it matters so much is that you only need a simple majority to pass the legislation, meaning you don't need 60 votes in the Senate. It's not subject to the Senate filibuster, and you only need a simple majority in the House to pass it. So as you mentioned rightly, Nat, it's not easy to do with such slim margins in the House and Senate, but it is something that the Republicans, if they can all coalesce around something, could enact some pretty sweeping policies. So just at the basic level, budget reconciliation starts with the passage of something called a congressional budget resolution, which is a budget plan that includes targets, and it also includes instructions to the House and Senate committees to alter their policies dealing with mandatory spending to reach that budget target. The policies will then reconcile the budget target, basically, which is why it's called budget reconciliation. So where are we now? Just to put this all in context, both the House and the Senate each have passed their own budget resolution. They are very far apart in numbers because, as you've probably all seen, the Senate would like to pursue a two-part approach to reconciliation, the first dealing with the border wall and energy, and the second dealing with taxes, whereas the House wants one big, beautiful bill, as I think they've termed it, which we've heard the president call for as well. So basically, what they now have to do, and what they're starting to do this week, we know some meetings are on the books, is the House and Senate will come together and figure out how to reconcile their budget resolutions to come up with a plan before then giving instructions to the committees to meet their targets. So you asked a very important question. Why and how does school choice fit into this tax legislation, to the budget reconciliation process? So first, it's eligible to be included because it's a tax provision. We're talking about a school choice tax credit. And as I started out, tax provisions are eligible to be included in reconciliation. Second, and I know my panelists will get into this, it's very popular. The Educational Choice for Children Act has, I think, 155 or more co-sponsors in the House and 31 in the Senate, including Majority Leader Thune. And we've also seen school choice programs explode across the country, which many on this call are expert in. So there's a desire from parents for more choices, and this federal school choice tax credit could complement many of the things that are going on in states. Third, it doesn't affect existing programs. It's a new credit, which makes it more politically feasible and not subject to arguments around taking away money from other programs in order to accomplish it. And then fourth, and this is probably one of the biggest ones, this would be part of a massive package with many different policies. So it would allow members to pass something and not have to take a standalone vote on school choice, which is hard for some members. There's a lot of pressure from unions or public school superintendents against something like this. Sometimes rural Republicans are skittish to vote on school choice initiatives. So this would be part of a massive package with tons of issues and considerations, making it easier to vote on the whole package than just having to take a vote on choice. And the other thing there is that this also matters because a credit would cost money. And so in order to deal with savings and figuring out a way to make it neutral, again, as part of a big package, there's lots of different things that will cost or save. So having school choice as part of something big, I think is a little bit easier. So then the last word on this before turning it back to you, Nat, is, the Educational Choice for Children Act has several provisions in it that will define and shape the tax credit. The interesting thing about reconciliation is that it's limited to provisions that directly affect the federal budget or federal spending. And that's why, you can't close the Department of Education, for example, on reconciliation. That's a non-budgetary item. So any policies that are included in reconciliation are subject to something called the Byrd Rule, meaning a senator can raise a point of order if they think a provision in the bill does not directly affect spending. So then what happens here is the Senate parliamentarian will say, this is a person in the Senate who basically can say up or down to whether or not something violates this Byrd Rule. So we'll have to see, how the provisions in ECA play out, which I know my panelists will talk about. But the general rule of thumb is if the policy outweighs the budgetary impact, then it can be struck out. I personally think a lot of ECA can survive because it's all about conditions on spending, but we'll have to see. But the Byrd Rule is probably the most important thing to watch here, because if in fact a Democrat raises a point of order and the parliamentarian says these provisions are more about policy than budget, then the school choice credit could be in a little bit of trouble, or some of the provisions around it. So we'll have to see, but this is definitely something to watch.
So, Lindsay, I want to get on to ECA or ECCA. I'm not sure what the lingua franca is on this, but the choice program. But a couple of questions. First, just to repeat back what I've heard, budget reconciliation allows you to pass this measure as sort of a big part of a much larger raft of policy changes that are budget related, with 50 votes in the Senate, or 51. So that is a big reason. One of the contentious things that we have to look out for that could block this would be the parliamentarian saying, no, it doesn't fit, or part of it doesn't fit. But there seems to be one more thing that might happen, and that is as Republicans are sort of cobbling together this large bill, there's a question, well, do they have enough sort of will to include this? Because it costs money. It's not a cutting measure. Is that something to be worried about? Or do you think that the Republicans are pretty certain to include this?
I mean, I think it matters in the larger context of, how they're going to deal with so many things that cost versus save in the plan. But that's why it's good to be included as part of the larger package. There is much bigger discussions with much bigger price tags than whatever they come up with this for this. I think it's like 5 billion or 10 billion, I think, at the high end. They can pick whatever number they want. So it does matter in the sense that yes, ultimately they'll have to find an offset, but it doesn't need to be a 1-to-1 if you were doing a standalone vote on this. So as part of a broader context, I think that's really important. But it's certainly eligible for inclusion here. The other thing, Nat, to your question is, right now you have very big, lofty goals, particularly in the House, in terms of how much savings they need to generate. As certain policies get taken off the table just because of sheer political will, the bill will become more narrow. Right now, my understanding, and I know John and can speak to this, there's a lot of will and desire from leadership to include this. But as things get narrowed, is this something that falls out because of cost? So that's important, but I think it being in larger context is what makes it safer from being eliminated.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lindsay. John, I do want to turn to you now. But before we get to the things that Lindsay was just talking about, first of all, let's get back to basics. This is time for choice, budget reconciliation, and federal school choice legislation. Let's talk about that legislation. What is the ECCA or ECA, and why is it the lead horse?
Well, thanks, Nat, and many thanks to AEI for doing this. Really appreciate it. This is a really important topic. Lindsay did a great job in explaining the reconciliation process. I will just say that reconciliation is our friend here because of that 60 vote threshold in the Senate. I mean, even the DCOSP, which is now in its 20th year, even the DCOSP could not get 60 votes in the Senate. Teachers unions just won't allow it. So reconciliation is indeed our friend here. So let me take a minute and talk about this federal scholarship tax credit and kind of how it works. As Lindsay noted, this is a thoroughly vetted and very popular policy idea. It's been around since 2013, but it really got a lot of traction in the first Trump administration, thanks to Secretary DeVos. And we owe her and her team a tremendous debt of gratitude for laying the groundwork that allowed us to get to this point. First and foremost, the Educational Choice for Children Act, the ECCA, some people call it ECHO. We always call it the ECCA. We'll defer to however you want to refer to it, Nat.
Fair enough.
At any rate, the ECCA, first and foremost, it is not a federal program. It is a tax bill. That's really, really important. There is no role whatsoever for the U.S. Department of Education in this bill. The ECCA has no bearing on whether the department is eliminated, on whether the funding in the department is redirected to other agencies, or whether it is liberated altogether. And by the way, I'm for that. I think that's a great idea, but I do think it will take some time in order to build that winning coalition in Congress in order to be able to do those things, which is why I think the ECCA needs to go first. The bill would provide 10 billion in annual tax credits funded by individual and corporate contributions to nonprofit scholarship granting organizations. If that sounds familiar to some of you, it's because 22 states have been doing this since the late 90s. The donors would receive 100% non-refundable tax credit, so there is no federal money being used for scholarships. The bill has near universal eligibility. The income threshold is 300% of median income by area, which covers about 90% of the K-12 kids in every state. There are also multiple uses for the ECCA. So the scholarships could be used for tuition, tutoring, special needs services, education technology, curriculum materials. The scholarship granting organizations, the SGOs, or school tuition organizations, as they're known in Arizona, they will determine the size and the type of the scholarship. Of these 10 billion in annual credits, each state would get 20 million if the SGOs can raise the funds. The remainder would be allocated on a first come, first served basis. And there's also an automatic escalator. So if we hit 90% of the cap, it would go up 5%. For states that have some form of private school choice already, the ECCA is additive. It can be stacked on top of whatever that state offers, which will increase purchasing power for parents and it will help more kids. In states that are education freedom deserts, mostly blue states, the ECCA will create real education freedom for the first time. It is a game changer for families in those states. If enacted at 10 billion in annual credits, we think this could potentially help up to 2 million kids around the country. And so think of it this way. It took us almost 35 years after the first choice program was enacted in Milwaukee before we got to 1 million kids who were benefiting. If we can get the ECCA passed at 10 billion, we could potentially double that in 2 years, which would be a great thing for families and kids. Probably not a great thing for Randy Weingarten. I'm not sure she'd be happy with that. So I will stop there.
Well, John, I have a boatload of follow-up questions, but I'm going to let Lindsay and Mike in and get their views first. So just hold on for a minute before the questions come. Mike, let me bring you in here and just ask you for your reactions. You've been paying attention to school choice for a long time. You've been watching these ideas come, some go, some flourish. What do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. Thanks so much for having me here today. Federal school choice is one of these things that there's been these debates that have been somewhat, for a lot of them, sort of esoteric within ed choice. When I got involved in this 10 or 15 years ago, there was a big debate of like, are vouchers or tax credits? Like, which one is better? And that's, there were people lined up on, I'm seeing knowing nods on this, like, oh God, remember those? And I think this federal one's always been one because it split so many of the more limited government federalist folks that are super pro school choice, but are really skeptical of a federal role versus other people who want to find ways to do some things that John was just talking about. So it's been one of these kind of internecine debates that's happened over time. My 2 cents is that I think that ECA or ECCA is the best thing that we've seen in trying to square this circle, right? Or I was trying to think of like, what's the metaphor? Is it walking the tightrope? Is it threading the needle? Is it however we want to look at it, of trying to balance, expanding opportunity via these big pots of federal money that the federal government's, able to marshal resources like few institutions on earth, and 2 million kids suddenly getting scholarships would be a massive sea change in the situation. But then also worrying about it is, and while I think again it's great that it's not entangling the Department of Education, it is entangling the IRS, and thinking about making sure that those scholarship granting organizations and thus the families and schools that participate can still have their autonomy respected. And obviously, look, I think that there are ways to do this. I was looking at the different tax credits that were offered, like as parts of the Inflation Reduction Act or the clean cars and clean energy. It's just a simple form that you add to your taxes that you say, hey, I put a solar panel on my house and this is how much I paid. It's like a single page and you can get access to that tax credit. So now who knows the wrangling of like what solar panels got included and didn't, and maybe that was in there as well. So look, I think that this bill is a tough order to try and satisfy a lot of different people of saying we kind of want the federal government involved, but we don't want the federal government involved. And I think the ECCA threads that needle. It's not perfect, and I think we can maybe have some discussion here of I think some of the concerns that we should have or that we should think about, but nothing is. And so on balance, I think it's worthy of support.
Thanks, Mike. And finally, Lindsay Burke, let me go to you. The same question as Mike, but I also want to ask you, how does this affect? I mean, the school choice has been ramping up pretty dramatically over the past several years. Obviously, a lot more money is probably better for school choice. I get that part. As you look at the potential for the ECCA, is it just a boon? How does it work with existing programs? Is it designed well to sort of complement those, or do you see some tripwires out there?
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me. And I grant John's point a minute ago that it took a long time to hit 1 million kids participating in school choice programs across the country. I mean, it took decades. And it took a lot longer prior to that to even get the idea from this academic idea that Milton Friedman had in 1955 to where we are today. And it's really only been in the past 4 years now, we can say, where we have seen it just go gangbusters in the States. I mean, if we take a step back just to appreciate the amount of momentum behind school choice, it's incredible. Not a single state 4 years ago had a universal school choice, universal eligibility school choice program. And today we are at 14. And with the addition of Wyoming, Idaho, and Tennessee this year, if we tag on Indiana, New Hampshire, and potentially Texas, we could be at 17 this year, potentially 18, depending on what might happen in South Carolina. So, I mean, the fact that we could be at 18 states with universal eligibility school choice this year is phenomenal and just deserves some reflection. So I think as we're thinking about what it means with potentially adding on a federal tax credit scholarship on top of that, I think that that scholarship, and John addressed this to some extent, does need to reflect the direction that education choice is going in the states, right? We hardly even say school choice anymore. It's education choice because these programs are largely education savings accounts, right? We have refined the old Milton Friedman voucher model or tax credit model and have moved toward much more flexible education savings accounts. So making sure as this potential tax credit mechanism moves forward, to John's point, that there is the maximum amount of allowable uses for participating students and families is going to be really important. That we don't just say you can use it to offset tuition at a given private school, but that you can also use it to buy curricula, textbooks, that you can do special education services and therapies, online learning, hire a private tutor, whatever it might be that would set you up for success as a student. We want it to reflect that model that's going so well in the States. And then just a couple of other cautions as we see this hopefully move forward as part of reconciliation, just to make sure that we're really cognizant about any potential regulatory overreach. This is something that at the state level, of course, we've all learned over the years, making sure that SGOs in particular are free to work with, to give scholarships to families and schools that align with their missions, that administrative overhead costs are kept to a minimum, but that there's enough administrative funding for these SGOs to operate with fidelity. And then making sure that it's structured in such a way from the tax policy side that a particular group could not, say, capture a large amount of the tax credits. And I think the way John outlined it there, where you have a proportion of kids who are eligible state by state, does hedge against that. But it's something to be cognizant of, that you wouldn't want a particular group of a particular political bent to be able to capture all of the tax credits, is that those are distributed evenly across the state. So I think the biggest point to be cognizant of moving forward is just making sure that those regulations are kept as light as possible. Issues are going to come up around things like assessments, what that looks like moving forward in terms of accountability. And of course, we want this option to be as free as possible so that families can have the maximum number of options available to them when they're engaging in the school selection process. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks, Lindsay. John, let me ask you a little bit. A couple of these things that were mentioned are sort of like the defense in the plan. It's sort of obvious that we can get a lot more school choice if the federal government has a large tax credit. Okay, that makes sense. I'm sure you share concerns that you don't want. I mean, I've seen the Department of Ed put out some regulations from time to time. So there's some defense built into this. Can you talk about some of the particulars? And I mean, there's some design features in this bill that try and restrict the ability of the future federal government to regulate. So can you lay out a couple of those key features?
Yeah, so Nat, this bill was purposefully designed to have a limited federal footprint. That was really, really important. And as Lindsay noted, the other thing that's in there is the variety of educational uses. That was important. And I think, Nat, you had referenced, or maybe Lindsay referenced earlier, how important that is to rural members. That is important to rural members. But look, I've been in the school choice movement for a very long time, since the 90s, and I can tell you that defense is a fact of life for those of us who work in this space. It is critically important that we remain vigilant always. And we've been through, I don't know how many lawsuits over the last 35 years. When we pass a bill, somebody sues, and there are elections. Elections change the composition of state legislatures, governors, and elections will change the composition of the federal government. That's just inevitable. But I think what we've done in this bill is we've ensured that, number one, there is no role for the Department of Education. So the Department of Education will not be writing any rules and regulations with regard to the implementation of this bill. The Treasury Department, they will be writing some rules and regulations, for this reconciliation bill, as they did for the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And I can tell you, we're going to be very diligent about helping to work with allies around the country to make sure that we write very strong rules because we want to make sure that congressional intent is maintained in this bill. The bill currently contains a lot of protections for religious liberty and private school autonomy. That is very important to our allies around the country. And again, we always have to remain vigilant. So far be it for me to say, what the federal government's going to look like in 4 years. But I can tell you that we in the school choice movement will remain vigilant, always.
Nat, can I jump in here on a process reality?
Yeah.
So, kind of as I laid out, like the Byrd rule has these limitations about what can be included. I think what Lindsay and John laid out, all of those things are very important. I am not convinced all of those things could pass the Byrd rule test, right, in the Senate. And so basically, I absolutely agree that, we want to limit the regulations that come around this tax credit. But what if at the end of the day, and I'm not saying this will happen, the only thing that can make it through Byrd is there is a tax credit, period, right? And then Treasury is going to have to figure out some way to then add regulations around that to administer it. So there is this concern about the flip-flop, like from political party to political party, about how they hamstring some of this. So, I mentioned this as an important thing to watch. Anything that's like relevant to the condition of spending, the condition of funds can be in there. I'm very doubtful that any like hamstrings around regulation could probably make it. The uses of funds could probably make it maybe like limits on eligibility, maybe, but this is the open question, right? Like, and I guess John, Lindsay, I guess the trade-off to me is if we can just get a line that says there's a federal school choice tax credit with like some stuff around it, is it worth it to do with the dangers of regulation down the pike? Or is it something like we live to fight another day? Like, that's a question that I have.
And
Yeah.
Lindsay, to be particular on that, just for those who might not be so familiar, if you had a standalone bill and you had 60 votes, you could write as much regulation and defense into it as you want, but we just don't have that. So the question is, to use Mike's metaphors, as you're walking down the tightrope and you get to the place where you have to actually thread the needle, do you have to unload some of the regulation to get through on the Byrd rule? Is that right? Okay, John,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
that's right.
I overrode you.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the one thing that we should all be cognizant of as school choice advocates is we can't let the fear of something bad happening down the road prevent us from trying to help a whole bunch of parents and kids with education freedom right now. And somebody alluded to this earlier. One of the things we've got to have as we go into this process, and I'm just going to be very blunt, we need the Republicans to fight for us. Now, when the Democrats are in charge and they've got the White House and both houses of Congress, they push very hard to get whatever they want. And sometimes it appears like the reconciliation process has stretched like a rubber band, right? And I think as Lindsay noted, they were able to get a lot of things into the Inflation Reduction Act, into ARP. And look, we've got to have Republicans who are going to be fighting just as hard to get our priorities in this reconciliation bill. I mean, that's going to be very critical. And in addition, it's going to be very important that we have good rules that are going to be surrounding this, and we're going to be counting on the Treasury Department to do that, and we're going to be working very closely with them to make sure that they do that.
Mike, Lindsay, Burke, I wanted to ask you, a lot of this is predicated on a skinny federal tax credit. But somebody's got to have responsibility for doing this. It seems like a lot of the weight falls on the states and the SGOs in particular to sort of do this well. But and I'll sort of put this out there for anyone. There's some states without SGOs in them. So how much trust are we putting in the SGOs? And what are ways that as the school choice community, we say we should advocate for sort of quality assurance on that front? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think there are SGOs and then there are SGOs. And I'm not sure exactly how the law is written. So I would imagine in every state in the union, there are organizations that give scholarships for kids to go to school, right? Like there's the whatever Catholic diocese has their scholarship. So it seems to me, provided that it's actually not these almost as sort of like, I don't want to use the word fancy, but more articulated scholarship granting organizations that we've seen in the States. But if it's, I make a donation to a bunch of these organizations that already exist, and then I just claim that on my taxes, that seems to me to be a reasonable solution to this. And again, these could be organizations that already exist, and they would just like they have to file their nonprofit status. Maybe they'd have to file and get a tax ID number so that the donations are not only are now creditable, available to this. It seems to me that there are solutions to that. Now, again, this is all based on me sort of spitballing of how we could solve these problems. This all sort of runs back into what Lindsay articulated to I don't know the degree to which we can sort of do that ahead of time or whether that would be something done on the back end. But it seems to me scholarship granting organizations exist in all 50 states in the union. And if we're making it as simple as I make a donation to them and I can get a credit for it, that infrastructure is probably already there.
Yeah, and I think if that's what ultimately transpires, Mike's vision is the elegant solution, the elegant way to go about this. So we need to be vigilant that as the process unfolds, there isn't a regulation that says something to the effect of the SGOs have to give scholarships to every single kid who applies, right? That we want to make sure that SGOs can be mission specific, that they can retain their value, their unique identity. And so that's been something, frankly, that has been a bit of a rub in the States, right? As schools, tax credit scholarships in particular have unfolded, what does it mean for an SGO to retain its mission and identity? And so I think making sure that is safeguarded in this law is going to be really important as the process unfolds.
And Lindsay, again to repeat this back, so the logic being that if there's an existing scholarship granting organization, it doesn't have to be a fancy one in Mike's terminology, but they just grant scholarships. Now they have an opportunity to give people an opportunity to have a tax savings on that. Seems like a good deal. But if they want to streamline it only for Baptist students because they're a Baptist organization, then the choice is, the new choice is, well, you can offer people the tax credits and be less Baptist, or you can offer people who now have an opportunity to go elsewhere to grant organizations a tax credit an opportunity to give you a donation, but without a tax credit. So this could develop into a real problem with the given setup if regulations come down the pike.
And certainly there's a way to set this up where in statute, and to Lindsay Fryer's point about reconciliation aside, let's say there's an opportunity, or when the opportunity arises to regulate the program, to say that nothing in this proposal would interfere with an SGO's ability to operate according to its mission. It just, those safeguards need to be in there, and it's again something to be cognizant of.
John, you mentioned in your early remarks that, well, there's a lot of blue states, and we can just be straight about it. A lot of blue states are not jumping on the choice bandwagon, and a lot of red states indeed are. That's where the action is. Is the ECCA designed sort of purposefully to sort of break into these places where states are just have not shown interest in here? Or is it just designed to be open to whatever scholarship granting organizations are available? What's the logic here between blue and red states?
Well, the logic, Nat, quite honestly, is we want to be able to help kids in every state. And obviously, if you are a state that already has some form of private school choice, your families already have some degree of education freedom. And again, this will increase purchasing power for parents in those states, will help more kids. But if you are one of those blue states, if you are in one of those education freedom deserts, your state legislature and your governor, they're never going to pass this. It's just not going to happen. And so this is a real opportunity to really facilitate opportunity in those blue states for the very first time. And look, as education freedom advocates, I mean, what we're for, what we've always been for, is money to follow children. You know, we want parents to be in the driver's seat. We want them to be able to choose the best educational environment for their child. And if we were to pass the ECCA and we were to bring education freedom to a lot of these blue states, we're empowering parents for the first time. And I think that that is going to help this transformation that we are seeing. You know, as Lindsay noted in her remarks, we've just gone gangbusters with education freedom programs around the country. This is a great development. This is transformational. This is what is helping transform this antiquated 19th century system into a 21st century model where we're putting the interests of parents and students first, and the ECCA can help facilitate that.
John, you know, a lot of times when we talk about school choice programs, we look at one states versus another states, and there's a different average amount, or there's different absolute amount. There's eligibility requirements, there's means testing, there's a lot of different angles to these that states might put together. The federal government isn't doing that with the ECCA, and that's by design. And the states aren't doing it because, I don't know how to say this sort of in a softer way, it's a little bit of an end run around the states. So is it sort of anything goes on those designs, or are there parts of the ECCA that limit the amount of the scholarship or dictate how much the scholarship should be or what the portion of the federal tax credit is? How are those parts shaped?
Well, in terms of the portion of the federal tax, it is 100% non-refundable credit for the donors, for the individual and corporate donors. But in terms of the size and the type of the scholarship, that will be determined by the SGOs. I mean, they're going to be in the driver's seat here. And we think that that's important because we want to make sure that, you know, families will be able to get scholarships for whatever their particular student needs. And again, it was designed purposefully to have a limited federal footprint by demand, you know, by design. So we really do want to put parents in the driver's seat here.
Lindsay, Mike, really anybody, does that raise any concerns? I mean, again, I think it's good to have actually high value scholarships. I think a lot of the problem with school choice is that too often the programs do what they can do with what's politically possible, but oftentimes that's economically too little. But Mike, do you have any concerns over how this might play out when there doesn't seem to be much state regulation? At some point, we may want some. Am I totally off base?
No, you're not. I mean, because look, one of the things that I think we did learn early years ago now in tax credit programs, you know, one of the regulations that was important was people not donating money that then could go to their own child in a scholarship, essentially sort of like laundering it through one of these things. Well, we don't want that to happen. And so I think those are regulations that people figured out that said, okay, hey, yeah, that's not what this is designed for. That's not actually my sort of primary concern. I think being able to change the size of scholarships is really important because some people, like, the delta that they need to actually get into private schools is quite small. And so if you can get a lot of people just over that hurdle with $500 or $1,000 or $1,500, that's amazing. There's some people that need a ton, and that they should have access to that. So that flexibility is super important. What I just want to do is I think we need to, like, temper expectations here. And the reason I think we need to temper expectations, and I know, John, I love it. I think what Glenn Ross is back on Broadway, and you were like, ABC, always be closing. I love it. It's fantastic. But one of the things that I worry about, and I think, and frankly, this is kind of like a lesson from the OSP, because I see the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, which I see in a sort of parallel here, in the sense that it is an incredibly worthy program that we should support, but we should recognize that because of the way that it has been administered and the way that it's been funded, basically for its entire existence, it has had a sword hanging over it. That at any moment, you know, it's been the linchpin of certain budget negotiations and others. And we have to be honest that I think that has had a negative effect on that program. That if we really care about the supply side of school choice, that we want new schools to open, we want fantastic schools to build a new wing on their building and serve a couple hundred more kids, that sort of uncertainty is just poison for that. And so I think we need to be realistic given the volatility that we have in the federal government, given the way the sort of arm twisting and things that are going to happen to even get this over the line when there's unified Republican control and a president who's out banging the drum for this, I think we have to be realistic that in lots of these blue states, or frankly in others, you know, if I'm running a school there and now my school is eligible for these scholarships and a bunch of kids come in the door, and it's like, hey, you know, we could build a new wing, or we could like open up, you know, Our Lady of Mercy South. I think a lot of folks might say, well, I don't know if we can count on these scholarships for the 5, 10, 15, 20 years that we would need to justify building this new building. So do I think that this is an opportunity to fill a lot of excess capacity in schools? I mean, you look at, unfortunately, like in places like New York and others that are closing, Catholic schools and others, I think there's a huge opportunity where those seats exist. High school kids, particularly, where it's like only 4 years, and so you can get them in there, and that would be great. But am I confident that this is going to drive like the big supply side response that we want to see? People opening new schools expanding, et cetera. I don't necessarily see that. Again, that doesn't mean that this isn't worthy of support. It doesn't mean that it's not a good idea. It doesn't mean that it's not going to help kids. But I just want to be sort of careful in managing expectations of what might happen as a result of this program.
Nat, can I just tag on to what Mike was saying there? Because he's absolutely right. And it has been, so the DC voucher program has been, it goes without saying, a lifeline for participating families. But over the 2 decades plus now that it's been in existence, it's gotten weaker and weaker, unfortunately, served fewer kids over the years because of the volatility that Mike noted. And that volatility is both financial, but it's also political volatility. It's subject to an annual appropriations process. And so depending on who's in office, really determines whether or not that program's on solid footing. And so hopefully something that's built into the tax code does have more stability than a program like the OSP, where it is open to that annual appropriations instability year after year. But then the other thing, back to the regulatory caution, I mean, the OSP, every reauthorization that it's gone through, new regulations have been added onto that program. It used to be schools could just be recognized and didn't have to be accredited. Then they had to be on a path to accreditation. Now they have to be accredited in order to consider entering the program. And so that's led to a squeeze in the supply, to Mike's point, of participating private schools. They just say the juice isn't worth the squeeze. We've lost about 2/3 of our participating private schools in that program over the years. And so there just aren't enough left to really meet the needs and the demands of families. Oh, and by the way, inflation's eating into the amount of the scholarship. So all of these things we have to think about as we move forward with any sort of larger, more robust federal approach to school choice. So it's a good cautionary tale.
And one thing I'll add, I totally agree with what Mike and Lindsay said. I am personally concerned about the regulatory swing because we just seen how the federal government operates in so many different spaces. But the other side of it, though, and why I think, to John's point, we got to get in there no matter what. We got to get started early. You got to build a constituency on the ground across the states, right? DC is very small, but like if you have so many parents and families that are benefiting from these, it is so hard to take something away, right? Or change it in a negative way. And you'll have families and parents screaming, right, if they do that. So I think building the constituency, getting the support, people seeing the benefit can help outweigh some of the negative things that may come in shifts of political power.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I feel whether it's DCOSP or whether it's this, I mean, we need political courage. I mean, we need our folks to fight for this. That's really important. And I feel a lot better about where we are today because we have the most pro school choice president that we have ever had. He is all in on school choice. That is very, very helpful. We have very strong support among the leadership in Congress. Speaker Johnson is one of our strongest supporters in Congress, and this is a guy, when I was at AFC years ago, we were supporting Mike Johnson when he was a state legislator in Louisiana because Mike Johnson was all in for school choice then. He is all in for school choice now. So we've got a lot of great champions in Congress now. I feel like with everything that's been happening in the state, I think the mindset in Congress has really changed, and there's just more and more members who have really embraced this idea of education freedom and directly empowering parents, because I think they know it is both a policy winner and a political winner.
So let me remind our audience that we're going to go to Q&A here in about 5 or 6 minutes, taking your questions, and you can get those to Greg Fournier at greg.fournier@aei.org, or you can post on X at hashtag federal school choice. You mentioned, Mike, with quite serious concern about the stability and what that does for the supply side, and that makes sense. And we talked about sort of the regulatory side about that, and but we're talking about the Overton window being open for this because we can conceivably get it done through budget reconciliation. There's some concerns in that process about what we might have to trim to get it to the budget target. Next time, Lindsay, is this, if let's say this is a $10 billion a year program that gets up and is doing a lot of good work, and it's just everything that we could dream, but political winds change for other reasons. Is this on the chopping block the next time a Democratic administration comes in and says, you know, we actually want to do X, so we're going to cut ECCA?
Yes, I think that's possible, right? That doesn't mean not to do it, as we kind of all laid out the case for it. So I think kind of what I said earlier is what rings true. Build a constituency in blue and red states alike. Get families involved, get it utilized, get the impact of showing it makes a difference. If there's any type of results orientation or impact that we can measure, I think that's great. So that to me is the best way to protect against that, but not, that is just the reality, right? If you need to generate savings, a future Democratic administration, they don't care too much about savings. They don't care too much about cutting, right? So hopefully they just pile on, right? But it is, I think, it is a political thing to watch. And so the best way to buffer against that is to build the support in across the states on the ground.
That is exactly right. And look, the more families who are benefiting from this, the more politically toxic it becomes for the other side to start taking away these options. That's just a reality. And having said that, again, defense is a part of life. We do it in the states. We're going to have to do it at the federal level as well. And we're going to have to remain vigilant and keep fighting.
So for looking for that defense, you have to sort of make a beachhead in some of the blue states. I wonder, anybody on the panel, are there particular places where you're likely to get a beachhead on this? I mean, in all those blue states, there's Catholic schools that give scholarships. I mean, there's no blue state out there that doesn't have private schools operating. Is this going to be something that's a dam that's easy to break? Or is that too optimistic?
Look, I think it's going to take convincing the schools and school leaders to do it. It would not surprise me if at the beginning there's some skepticism or there's some education that needs to take place in order for that to happen. And I think that that's kind of the next, if something like this were to pass, that to me, I mean, there's probably parallel paths. One is looking at the regulatory and rulemaking side and making sure that that's all aligned. But at the same time, there needs to be a huge education effort that takes place. The polling work that we at EdChoice do, talking to parents and even school leaders and asking them, like, are you aware that there is a school choice program in your state? Even in some states that have very large programs, huge swaths of parents and school leaders don't even know that they exist. And so if you imagine it's a federal program that in the scheme of the federal budget is small, I can see how folks wouldn't even know that it existed. So working with the big kind of organizations like NCEA, National Catholic Education Association, working with the Lutheran synods, working with all of the different organizations that link these schools up, CAPE, I think would be a huge goal. But it's something that we really have to be thoughtful about, educating them and getting them to jump in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I can tell you, particularly after November 5th last year, people's interest in this, shall we say, skyrocketed quite a bit. Last year when we were building support for this, and we had almost 190 co-sponsors in the House and the Senate, which was more support from any school choice bill ever. But after the election, The number of calls we've been getting, and the number of meetings that we've been on trying to educate folks about just what Mike was talking about, it's been a lot, and we're going to keep doing it because we've got to build interest, build support. There are great organizations. Mike mentioned the NCEA. There are a lot of great organizations out there, a lot of great SGOs out there who've been doing this for a long time, who want to be helpful to new SGOs as they form. There are groups like the Children's Scholarship Fund who are talking to their state affiliates about this. ACE Scholarships talking to their state affiliates about this. So there's a lot of great interest out there, and we just got to keep educating them.
And
All
I'll
right,
just
well,
add one. Oh, can I add
go
one
ahead,
quick
Lindsay.
thing on that,
Quickly.
Nat? So, very quickly, I totally agree. And the hard work begins after it passes. And then the other thing, and Mike alluded to this very well, like the value proposition to the schools to like take scholarships will also depend on the regulatory process, like the regulations being low, right, and like not overburdensome. And so it's going to be a multi-pronged fight. But I'm confident that the John Schillings of the world and others will be out pounding the pavement out there.
All right, so we have a boatload of questions coming in, so I'm gonna have to stop asking mine, and these are gonna go quickly because we have a number of them. So jump in if you want to answer on any of these to all four of my panelists. First, should schools that receive ECCA money be subject to some kind of accountability, testing, anything, to ensure taxpayer money is being well spent and kids are actually learning? Anyone?
No. We really want private schools to retain their identities and their autonomy. And if students are not performing well in a private school, parents will leave. I mean, that's how it goes.
All right, let's go to a second one here. Schools depend on getting similar amounts of funding every year. So how would the ECCA ensure that schools get that? I mean, there is this question about how consistently the SGOs might operate when they need to, they need to upkeep their own fundraising and the SGO's own fundraising, so it's not the school's fundraising. But there's also this cap they have to work with. Is there a reliability question here that we should be concerned about? Mike?
Yeah.
You on the spot.
Yeah, sure. And I think also some of the kind of first come, first served, like how that's negotiated and figured out, like there seems to me some details there that we still need to be clear, because I don't think we would want to see wild swings from year to year. Like if somebody gets better at figuring out how to end run or get to the front of the queue there, and then suddenly there's this baseline level that's there for every state, but I think the majority of it could kind of swing around there. So no, I think that's definitely something that could be worrisome. If you can bring in $10 million this year, but because of the order of people that came in, you can't do the same the next year, that has knock-on effects for everybody, for the families, for the schools, everything.
I think that's right, but I'd also argue, like, how is that any different than, let's say, private schools operate year to year, right? You're always subject to people not re-enrolling and like maybe a fiscal fluctuation. So yes, Mike is right, but also let's be based in reality. I think schools deal with this all the time.
And the SGOs will have up to 2 years to expend funds, so they'll have a little bit of runway here.
I got another one, and John, this one may go straight to you. What's the advantage of ECCA over giving federal tax credits directly to families paying tuition at private schools?
The old refundable tax credit arguments. Well, there are some states that are going down this path, but first of all, I mean, to give everybody a refundable tax credit, I think there might be a cost issue there. That would be an awful lot of money. And when you're talking about the offsets that you're going to need for 10 billion annual credits, I think that you would need substantially more offsets if you were giving out refundable tax credit. And then there's the issue of impact. If you are a low income family, what is a $500 or $1,000 refundable tax credit going to get for you. I mean, it may allow you to buy an education service, but it's certainly not going to help you pay for private school tuition if that's where you want your child to go. So I just don't think a refundable tax credit has that kind of impact. Now, having said that, I think what we're seeing now with these discussions about getting rid of the Department of Education and liberating the funds, look, I would like to see as much of that funding as possible get right down to parents. And I think that would be very, very helpful. But but again, in terms of the direct amount, you got to have something that's going to have impact.
And John, isn't there also something about like being a direct recipient of federal funds, the strings that come attached to it in terms of like civil rights rules and stuff?
Yeah.
I mean,
So
that's an argument too. The SGO is the middle ground, buffers families from that, right? And
correct,
schools.
correct. Private schools cannot be the direct recipient of federal funds because it comes with all those fun federal regulations and such. And people may remember this from the Paycheck Protection Program, during COVID. They had to figure out a way where you could try to help non-public schools where they could be eligible for Paycheck Protection Program without being the recipient of direct federal funds.
Lindsay Burke, I'd like to hear your answer to this question. Assuming the ECCA is passed, and what we sort of expect, what do you think the state of school choice looks like 5 to 10 years into the future? I mean, based on current levels of demand for private and charter schools, would a plurality of U.S. students still opt for public education?
Well, potentially not, but that has nothing, I would argue, to do with what happens with the ECCA. The ECCA could supercharge efforts, but we're moving in that direction one way or the other, which is good news for families. So if I rattled off the list a little while ago of states that are moving toward universal education choice. Well, one of those includes Texas. And if Texas ends up with a universal eligibility school choice this year, that would mean, I think if I have the number correct, about 58% of all kids in the country would be eligible to participate in an education choice program in the States. I mean, that's a game changer, right? I mean, this is just a phenomenal tipping point potentially for how we think about the delivery of K-12 education in this country and who has access to schools that are safe and effective and aligned with their values. So that train's like out of the station, it's down the tracks, whatever metaphor we want to use. Like school choice is just really unfolding at a rapidly welcome pace right now. I think the federal tax credit, if that were to move forward, would, if anything, probably supersize these efforts. But again, I do think we need to be cautious about the regulatory impact down the road, and then make sure that, and John has talked about how so far it looks like it will do this, but that it does conform to where education choice is at the moment, which is to say that it is flexible, that families can use those dollars in the maximally flexible way possible, and that ideally those funds you would be able to roll over from year to year, making it an actual savings account. And this, just a quick aside, because in the States right now, as the education choice movement is not only growing rapidly, but I think becoming more sophisticated in how it thinks about what constitutes a genuinely universal and effective education choice program. Those are some of the key components, right? To be an ESA, you got to have the S. You have to be able to save and roll over dollars from year to year and potentially roll them into a college savings account. We do need these options to be truly universal ultimately, which you may notice, the savvy listener, that we're now distinguishing between universal eligibility and universal programs, right? If you look in the states, there are probably only 4 programs in the country right now, 4 states that are actually universal. And so these are all just features that we need to make sure we are supporting in any effort, be it federal or state, that they're genuinely universal, ideally formula funded, and have that savings component. And by the way, aren't burdened with regulations that look in particular like a state test mandate.
So I want to thank you all. We got time for one more question. I also want to thank our audience. There's too many questions that I want to get to, and I'm not allowed to extend the webinar. So I'm just going to thank you all for that. The last one here, I think, is an interesting one, and I'll take all takers. Are there concerns about the strategy for the distribution of the tax credit? For example, if only 10% of the annual volume cap is evenly divided by the states, what about the other 90%?
Yeah, so that's the first come first serve issue. And for us, one of the thing this is to the point that was made earlier. This is why it's really important to be out there educating folks, whether it's scholarship granting organizations or other 501c3 organizations who currently offer scholarships. We want to make sure that everybody is aware of this option. And so everybody is thinking about how to do this well ahead of time. And look, I mean, we've got this $20 million base for every state. I am not anticipating that every state is going to utilize that. And so, those that don't utilize it, that goes back into the bucket. But it is going to be incumbent upon organizations in these states, scholarship granting organizations, and the donors to be, to get on this right away. And we're going to try to help them do it.
Lindsay Fryer, before we cut out, one question that's right up your lane. If this happens, when will we know? How long does this process take? Short answer.
Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have more clarity.
All right. Hey, Lindsay Fryer, Lindsay Burke, John Schilling, and Mike McShane, thank you for joining us and just explaining this pretty complicated but pretty exciting topic. I want to thank everybody else for joining. And that's all from AEI.